The doctor's order was absolute and unambiguous. "You cannot perform, doctor," Gary Zucker told Louis Armstrong on the morning of March 6, 1971. "Your heart can't handle it. Your kidneys are failing. If you go on that stage tonight, you could die. Not metaphorically, literally die, right there in front of everyone." Louis, 70 years old, sitting in his home in Queens with Lucille beside him holding his hand so tightly it hurt, listened to the doctor's words and then said something that revealed everything about who he was and what he valued. "Doc, I appreciate your concern, but there are people expecting me tonight. I made a commitment. I'm going." Lucille's grip tightened, the doctor's face went pale, and Louis Armstrong began preparing for what would be his final performance. 10 minutes on stage at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, 10 minutes that would end with the song "We Have All the Time in the World," an irony so cruel it feels like the universe was making a point. 10 minutes that would leave Louis collapsed backstage, rushed to the hospital, never to perform again. 2 months later, on July 6, 1971, Louis Armstrong would be dead. But on March 6, he would choose the stage over his health, performance over survival, identity over existence. The question this story forces us to ask isn't whether Louis made the right choice. It's whether he ever really had a choice at all. Louis Armstrong had been performing since he was a child in New Orleans, singing on street corners for coins. 55 years of performance by 1971. 55 years of defining himself through his ability to make music, to entertain, to bring joy to audiences. His trumpet was an extension of his body, his voice was an extension of his soul, and the stage was where those extensions had meaning, purpose, value. Without performance, Louis didn't know who he was. He'd never developed an identity separate from being Louis Armstrong the entertainer. No hobbies that didn't connect to music. No relationships that weren't mediated through his fame. His marriage to Lucille was strong, yes, but even that relationship was built on the foundation of Louis's career, with Lucille managing his schedule, protecting his time, enabling his artistry. If Louis stopped performing, he wasn't just retiring from a job. He was erasing the core of his identity. The health problems had been building for years. Kidney disease diagnosed in the late 1960s. Heart issues that made climbing stairs a challenge. Doctors telling him to slow down, to rest, to retire, and Louis ignoring all of it, continuing to tour, to record, to perform. Not because he didn't understand the risks. Louis knew his body was failing, knew every performance was pushing him closer to collapse. But he also knew something else, that stopping would kill him faster than performing would. That the emptiness of not being on stage, not making music, not doing the thing that gave his life meaning, would destroy him in ways that physical illness couldn't. By March 1971, Louis's condition had deteriorated to the point where even he couldn't fully hide it. He'd been hospitalized multiple times in the previous months. His breathing was labored, his energy limited. Walking from his bedroom to his living room required rest breaks. The idea of him performing an entire concert was absurd. Everyone knew it. The promoters knew it, the band members knew it, Lucille knew it, the doctors certainly knew it, but Louis had committed to appearing at the Waldorf Astoria for a benefit concert, and Louis Armstrong honored his commitments, even when those commitments might kill him. The morning of March 6, after Dr. Zucker's warning, Lucille tried one more time to convince Louis to cancel. She'd been trying for days, maybe weeks, knowing this performance was dangerous, knowing Louis's stubbornness might literally be the death of him. "Pops," she said, using his nickname, trying to reach the man beneath the performer, "you don't have to do this. They'll understand. Everyone will understand. Your health is more important than one show." Louis looked at her with an expression she'd seen before, an expression that mixed love and determination and something darker, resignation maybe, or acceptance. "Lucille," he said, "I have to go, not because they expect me, because I need to. If I can't perform, then what am I? Who am I? I'm Louis Armstrong," and Louis Armstrong shows up. That answer reveals the tragedy at the heart of the story. Not that Louis valued performance over health, though he did, but that he'd built an identity so completely dependent on being on stage that he couldn't imagine himself existing without it. Retirement wasn't an option because it felt like death anyway. At least performing gave him death with purpose, with an audience, with one last moment of being who he'd always been. The choice between dying on stage or dying in a hospital bed wasn't really a choice. One let him be Louis Armstrong until the end. The other turned him into a sick old man waiting for The inevitable, the preparation for the performance was painful to watch. Louis needed help getting dressed. His tuxedo, tailored to fit him perfectly in better days, now hung loose on a frame that had withered from illness. Lucille helped him with his bow tie, her hands shaking as she tied the knot, both of them knowing this might be the last time. The trumpet, his beloved instrument that he'd played for decades, felt heavy in his hands, a sign of weakness he couldn't ignore but wouldn't acknowledge. The car ride to the Waldorf Astoria was silent, Louis conserving energy, Lucille crying quietly in a way she thought he couldn't see, but he could, he always could. Backstage at the Waldorf, the other performers and organizers reacted with visible shock when they saw Louis. He looked like a man who should be in a hospital, not a concert hall. Gray diminished, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had become an obstacle rather than an instrument. People whispered, should they cancel his segment, should they insist he not perform, but no one had the courage to tell Louis Armstrong he couldn't do what he'd traveled here to do. And Louis, sensing their hesitation, their concern, their pity, smiled and said, I'm fine, just need to catch my breath, I'll be ready when it's time. The announcement came. Ladies and gentlemen, Louis Armstrong. The applause was thunderous. Louis walked onto the stage of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom, and for a moment something changed in him. The physical frailty didn't disappear, but something else emerged. Presence, the thing that had made Louis Armstrong for 55 years activated. He smiled at. The audience raised his trumpet and began to play. Those first notes were shaky. The audience could hear it. The band could hear it, but Louis pushed through, using technique built over decades to compensate for strength he no longer had. His face showed the effort, sweat appearing almost immediately despite the cool temperature. Breathing labored between phrases, but the music still came, imperfect, yes, struggling, absolutely, but still recognizably Louis. Still that unique sound, that distinctive phrasing, that sense of joy even in difficulty. He played for approximately 10 minutes, 3 songs total, each one shorter than it should have been, with Louis conserving energy, cutting verses, simplifying arrangements to match his diminished capacity. The audience responded with ovations after each number, their applause. Carrying more than appreciation, it carried recognition that they were witnessing something historic and tragic. Louis Armstrong's final performance. Though they didn't know it was final, they knew it was significant. They knew they were seeing an artist refuse to surrender to age and illness, insisting on being himself one more time. The final song was We Have All the Time in the World, written by John Barry and Hal David for the James Bond film On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Louis had recorded it in 1968, and it had become one of his signature pieces in his later years. A beautiful, romantic ballad about love and timelessness, about having all the time in the world to be together. And on March 6, 1971, Louis Armstrong sang those words knowing they were lies, knowing he didn't have time, knowing this was probably his last performance. Irony was so heavy it hurt to witness. We have all the time in the world, Louis sang, his gravelly voice more gravelly than ever, strained by illness but still carrying emotion that perfect voices couldn't achieve. Time enough for life to unfold all the precious things love has in store. He sang about eternity while dying, sang about tomorrow while having no tomorrows left. And the audience, perhaps sensing the subtext, perhaps just responding to the beauty of the performance, gave him a standing ovation that continued long after the final note faded. Louis stood on that stage, accepting the applause, smiling despite the pain radiating through his body, despite knowing he'd just given everything he had left. He raised his trumpet one final time in acknowledgement, bowed slightly, carefully, not trusting his balance, and then walked off stage. Slowly holding himself together through pure will until he was out of the audience's sight. Backstage, the collapse was immediate. Louis's legs gave out. Band members caught him before he hit the floor. Lucille screamed. Someone called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived within minutes, finding Louis conscious but clearly in crisis. His heart rate was erratic, his breathing shallow, his color wrong. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to Beit Israel Hospital, sirens blaring through New York streets, Lucille riding beside him, holding his hand, saying over and over, "Why did you do this? Why didn't you listen?" At the hospital, doctors stabilized Louis but delivered news that wasn't really news. His condition was critical. The performance had put enormous strain on his already failing systems. He would survive this. Immediate crisis, but he needed complete rest, no performances, no travel, no activities beyond what his body could handle without stress. Louis, even from a hospital bed, even having just collapsed, asked when he could perform again. The doctor's answer was gentle but firm. "Mr. Armstrong, you can't. That was your last performance. I'm sorry, but if you go on stage again, you won't survive it." Louis returned home to Queens after a week in the hospital. And for the next 2 months he existed in a state that wasn't quite living. He couldn't perform, couldn't play his trumpet for more than a few minutes without exhaustion, couldn't be the person he'd been for 7 decades. Lucille tried to help him find purpose in other things, spending time with friends, listening to music, enjoying the home they'd built together. But Louis was haunted by those 10 minutes at the Waldorf, his final performance, the last time he'd been Louis Armstrong instead of a sick old man waiting to die. On July 6, 1971, exactly 4 months after that final performance, Louis Armstrong died in his sleep. Heart failure, kidney failure, system failure. The doctors said he'd lasted longer than they'd expected, that his heart should have given out months earlier. Lucille believed she knew why he'd held on as long as he did. He was processing those final 10 minutes, replaying them, finding meaning in them, making peace with the fact that his last performance, while diminished from his prime, was still recognizably him, still Louis. And once he made peace with that, once he'd accepted that his final statement as an artist was complete, he could let go. The story of Louis Armstrong's final 10 minutes on stage forces questions that don't have comfortable answers. Was it heroic or tragic? Was Louis demonstrating admirable commitment or destructive obsession? Should we celebrate his dedication to performance or mourn his inability to exist without it? The answer probably is all of the above. Louis's choice to perform despite medical warnings, despite knowing the risks, despite having every rational reason to stay home, was simultaneously noble and heartbreaking. It was noble because it demonstrated integrity. Louis Armstrong had built a career on showing up, on delivering for audiences, on being reliable and professional regardless of circumstances. That final performance maintained that standard. He'd made a commitment, people were expecting him, and he honored that commitment even though it cost him dearly, theirs. Something admirable in that consistency, that refusal to compromise his standards even when compromise would have been completely understandable. But it was also heartbreaking because it revealed how completely Louis had tied his identity to performance. He couldn't imagine himself as valuable, as worthy, as Louis Armstrong without an audience. The idea of retirement, of stepping back, of being just a person rather than a performer, was so foreign to him that death seemed preferable. That's not dedication, that's pathology. That's what happens when you define yourself so completely by what you do that you can't separate your worth from your productivity. This dynamic resonates powerfully in 2026, in an era where burnout culture has made heroes of people who work themselves to exhaustion, where we celebrate entrepreneurs who sleep in their offices and artists who never stop creating and performers who tour until they collapse. Louis Armstrong's final performance becomes both inspiration and warning. Yes, commitment matters. Yes, showing up matters. But there's a line between dedication and self-destruction, and Louis crossed it. He chose performance over life, and while that choice allowed him to be Louis Armstrong until the end, it also ended him. The irony of "We Have All the Time in the World" as his final song cannot be overstated. It's almost too perfect, too poetic, too on the nose. But it happened. Louis Armstrong, dying, sang about having all the time in the world. The universe's sense of irony is sometimes unbearably precise, and that irony forces the central question: did Louis know? Did he understand that this was his final performance, that these were his last notes? That this song would be his goodbye? Lucille believed he did. In interviews after Louis's death, she would talk about that morning, about how Louis prepared for the performance with a sense of finality, how he looked at her differently, how he said "I love you" in a tone that felt like farewell, how he touched his trumpet like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. She believed Louis knew he was giving his last performance, knew the risks were too high, knew he might not survive. And he performed anyway, not despite knowing, but because of it. Because if he was going to die, he wanted to die as Louis Armstrong the performer, not Louis Armstrong the invalid. That choice, that agency in his final performance adds another layer of complexity. If Louis didn't know, if he genuinely believed he'd perform again, then his decision to push through illness was misguided but hopeful. But if he did know, if he understood this was the end, then his decision becomes something else. It becomes choosing how to exit. It becomes staging his own farewell. It becomes taking control of the one thing he still could control, how his story as a performer would end. The 2 months Louis lived after his final performance were, by all accounts, difficult. He struggled with depression, with purposelessness, with the loss of the identity that had sustained him for 7 decades. He'd try to practice his trumpet and wouldn't have the breath. He'd listen to recordings of his past performances and feel the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become. Lucille would find him crying sometimes, not from physical pain but from existential pain, from the grief of being alive but not being able to live in the way that mattered to him. That grief suggests that Louis's choice to perform on March 6, while it shortened his life, might have been the right choice for him. Because those 2 months of invalid existence, of being unable to perform, of being trapped in a body that couldn't do what defined his life, were torture. Louis had chosen the stage over health because the alternative, health without the stage, wasn't actually preferable. It was just slower dying, more conscious suffering. More time to contemplate the loss of everything that made him him. This story matters in 2026 because we're in an era obsessed with optimization, with productivity, with extracting maximum value from every moment. We celebrate people who sacrifice health for achievement, who push through pain for performance, who demonstrate commitment by demonstrating self-destruction. Louis Armstrong's final 10 minutes become a mirror. Do we see heroism or tragedy, dedication or pathology, a life well lived or a cautionary tale? The answer depends on what you value. If you value consistency, professional commitment, showing up regardless of circumstances, then Louis's final performance is admirable. He honored his commitments. He maintained his standards. He refused to let illness define him. He went out as Louis Armstrong the performer rather than Louis Armstrong the patient. There's dignity in that choice. But if you value sustainability, health, the ability to exist beyond your professional identity, then Louis's final performance is tragic. He couldn't imagine himself as valuable without an audience. He'd never developed an identity that could survive retirement. He worked until it literally killed him, and we remember that as beautiful rather than broken. There's pathology in that choice. Both perspectives are valid. Both contain truth. Louis Armstrong's final 10 minutes on stage were both heroic and tragic, admirable and pathological, beautiful and broken. They were the logical conclusion of a life spent entirely in service of performance, entirely defined by the ability to entertain. And when that ability failed, when the body couldn't support the identity anymore, Louis faced a choice between slow death without meaning or fast death with one final moment of being himself. He chose the latter, chose the stage, chose performance, chose Louis Armstrong the entertainer over Louis Armstrong the person, because for him those weren't separable categories. 10 minutes, March 6, 1971, Waldorf Astoria, we have all the time in the world. Collapse, hospital, 2 months, death, that was the trajectory, that was the cost, that was the choice Louis Armstrong made, knowing or sensing the risks, performing anyway because performance was who he was and he couldn't imagine being anyone else. In the end, whether we call it dedication or obsession, heroism or tragedy, the result is the same. Louis Armstrong performed until he couldn't anymore, gave his final 10 minutes everything he had left. Sang about having all the time in the world while having almost none, and then died 2 months later, having been Louis Armstrong the performer until the final possible moment. That was his choice, his final performance, his goodbye, and nearly every note was a lie about time, but every note was truth about identity. He was Louis, he was on stage, he was playing his trumpet and singing his song, and for those 10 minutes, despite everything failing in his body, despite knowing what this was costing him, he was exactly who he'd always been, completely himself, completely Louis, even if being completely himself meant destroying what was left of his health, even if those 10 minutes cost him whatever time he might have had left. They were his 10 minutes, his choice, his final statement. And 2 months later, when he died, at least he died knowing his last act as an artist was complete, diminished but complete, struggling but authentic, final but unforgettable. Louis Armstrong's last 10 minutes on stage, singing about having all the time in the world, when time had already run out.